Welcome to the Friday, April 24th edition of Hormatsky's Weekly Wrap-Up, where we look at news from the past week from Ukraine and Eastern Europe. I'm Carrie Oderman, this week with Maria Romanenko in the studio. Promises, polls, and the perfect call. Just over a year ago, on April 21st, Ukraine saw the end of a long presidential campaign. Volodymyr Zelenskyy was elected president with a sweeping margin of nearly 73%, beating incumbent President Petro Poroshenko, who received just 25%. At the time, political commentators claimed that the elections were a referendum on how politics was being conducted in Ukraine. But has really so much changed? To talk about President Zelenskyy and the year since his election, we have two guests in the studio today. From the Kyiv School of Economics, Svitlana Khutka is here. She's an expert in public diplomacy, political culture, and values. Oleksandr Suhsko, he's a research director at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation in Kyiv and a member of the Maidan People's Union, is also here. Like I say every week, I'm an outsider looking in, and I'm going to ask the questions our English-speaking viewers have. Our guests will give us background, create context, and help us cut through some of the noise. And because we're live in the studio again for the first time since lockdown, don't forget this is your chance to tweet at us and ask some questions of our guests. Now, on to our main topic. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy won the presidency, and he's been shaping policy for nearly a year. To mark the anniversary of his election, several Ukrainian television channels showed a 50-minute documentary about his presidency. Of course, internationally, Zelenskyy's name is always prefaced by the fact that he's a comedian turned politician. The film, which was created by his office, underscored his telegenic show business history. But a lot like what's on TV, what's real and what's special effects. We're going to see what our guests have to say as we talk about the promises, polls, and the perfect call 1 year into his presidency. We're going to show a clip from this Zielinski special a few minutes later in this show. But Maria, you watched the show. Could you give us a quick takeaway before we go to our guests?
Yeah, I watched the film. I mean, it's very laudatory, as you said. Zelenskyy has a background as an actor, a comedian, so you can see it through the film. And what I really liked, I saw some of the comments that my friends, other journalists, left on social media after they watched the film, and one of my friends, she's also a journalist, she said that, from now on, I'm going to call every interview I do a documentary film, because that's a trend now. So I kind of agree with the point that she made that this could have been an interview. Like, it's a bit weird that it's a film, and it includes some of the, it includes footage from 1+1 TV channel, which is a Kolomoisky, who, is owned by Kolomoisky, who's a business partner of Zelenskyy. Overall, it's very laudatory. There's not enough. There's not any really criticism. But I mean, it probably is hard to criticize yourself. But that's just the general comments that I
can't wait to ask our guests if their opinion of what he showed from his first year is the same of what really happened. Let's go to our guests. As the situation dictates, our two guests are with us, not in the studio, but they're with us online. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of moderating. My first question is going to go to Oleksandr Suhsko. I'd like to talk with you about the promises he made, President Zelenskyy, before his election, how he's came through with that. What were some of the most important promises he made that really had an effect on the public and encouraged people to select him as Ukraine's president?
I think Volodymyr Zelenskyy is quite lucky with his promises because he made, frankly, no promises. And that was one of his slogans used during his campaign, no promises. And in fact, certainly many people associated some promises and expectations with him. Certainly there were a lot of hope of change. But mostly it was just connected with the perception of the Zelenskyy individuality, his personal features, not with a real political program. So finally, after 1 year, we may say that Zelenskyy basically fulfills his promises not having any promises. But taking this seriously, I may say that, in fact, everybody may associate their own promises with him. So that was a part of the story for everybody, a part of the story. And each of his voters may expect some promises to fulfill. However, that was rather his own voters' promises and expectations than real promises by Zelensky.
So everyone was looking for what they were searching for and found in his words. Svitlana, you've been doing a lot of research on what Ukrainians and the Ukrainian voter thinks about President Zelensky. When he initially won with nearly 73% of the votes, didn't it raise some eyebrows? And what could our international viewers maybe understand from you about the nature of the Ukrainian voter and what the 73% meant last April?
Well, I wouldn't say that for Ukrainian analytics it was some kind of surprise, because Kyiv International Institute of Sociology and other companies, they actually have been tracing the rankings of Volodymyr Zelensky, and it was very high, especially after he announced that he is going to step into the rally. And I was a part of the national exit poll, which actually was releasing results of the electoral opinion of our citizens. And while it was the hope to, support the person who was not involved into the old political networks. And if we would jump to the latest surveys, public opinion polls, which were conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, we can see that we have two different points when it's about the Volodymyr Zelensky. First of all, it's about trust, and second point, it's about electoral support. Let's talk about the electoral support for now. Now it's still very high, and what is really surprising is that if now people would have to vote for somebody to be a president, he still would get quite a lot of voices, and maybe even 14, 15 more voices than earlier. But it's not because of the trust to Volodymyr Zelensky, because trust to him is dropping down, and he actually lost almost 30% of his trust across the year. So why it is so? Why we have this contradictory result? Because actually, when it's about the electoral support, it's about the alternatives. And unfortunately, in contemporary, in modern political, field, we don't have those bright leaders who would capture the leadership for Ukrainian politics. And so this electoral support is pretty high, even though the support of the decisions which are made by the government of Volodymyr Zelensky are very low, because people are not happy with what's going on in the economy. People are not happy with the, trends actually in the general political agenda, and people are not happy with what's going on in perspective, especially due to the pandemic crisis, which actually have been intertwining with the general economic crisis the country coming in for last several months. So we have very complicated context of what's going on now in Ukraine.
Dropping 30% in the polls would be something detrimental to most politicians. Being as though he had 73%, there was really no place to go but down. Already winning with 73%, it did internationally raise some eyebrows, because in a healthy democracy, people usually don't win by such large margins. Let's go back to the point, and I'm directing this question at Oleksandr, this idea that it was a referendum on politics as usual in Ukraine, and now in the past months, especially since March, when he's been flipping around his cabinet, he's been bringing a lot of people that were in politics in the past back into politics. What's changing?
The major problem of Zelensky, that, as I said, he promised almost nothing, but he, at the same time, generated very huge expectations. And most of those expectations were not realistic. And one of those non-realistic expectations was that the political culture, political system of the country may be changed overnight. So there were lots of illusions that some new faces led by Zelensky will come and change their entire life. That was a celebration of a paternalistic Ukraine, which were waiting for miracle, in fact. And miracle just didn't happen. And now this kind of I would say disappointment spreading is just connected to this fact that the miracle is no longer possible. And one of these illusions was that can be the politics without politicians. That the politics may come with actors, with people from show business, with some other people who never worked in politics. So that was an illusion, and now that it becomes obvious. Unfortunately, understanding the failure of this initial idea of the politics without politics, now Zelensky is in fact trapped with the shortage of time and with the shortage of his team. So he has no other people in his team to replace other ones. And that is why he is just looking for some people whom he can appoint to certain positions. And most of these appointments are coming from the old political elite, from the old business, all these usual faces. And suddenly that demonstrates the overall shortage of his conceptual approach to politics with which he arrived a year ago.
Svitlana, I know that you work a lot with hard numbers and facts, so I'm going to go back to Oleksandr with this question because it's dealing with feelings. A lot of times internationally, a leader is seen much differently than they're seen domestically. Right now comes to mind Angela Merkel, who in 2016 with the migrant crisis was celebrated internationally, but domestically she received a lot of criticism. How is Zelensky seen internationally as opposed to domestically? Where are the big differences? Oleksandr?
Sorry? Are you asking me? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, this is very diverse picture. Certainly there were some expectations that Zelensky becomes more, I would say, more able to solve the problems with regards to Ukraine, which the previous leadership was not ready to solve in the way that was expected. And certainly Zelensky, especially in the beginning, he was demonstrated that he is quite different from Poroshenko. For example, he was not so strong in pushing some messages to the foreign leaders. Vice versa, he was quite ready to listen to them. And that created a lot of sympathy because he was a guy to come and to say, give me your advice. I'm ready to listen to you. And that was quite emotionally well accepted by many international leaders. But then what goes next? And there was a problem because it happened then after this initial, I would say, psychological success of a connection with international leaders. He was some way unable to present any kind of the program. So he was quite, in my opinion, naive, believing that he may really achieve the significant progress with Minsk agreement implementation. So that was initial illusion of many in the West, not only in Ukraine. But Zelensky also put himself into this trap. And he promised in the West that, look, I came in order to fulfill this Minsk agreement. But then, just in a few months, he, step by step, he understood that these agreements are not implementable. And now, then again, he is in a position to disappoint those who expected from him something. So his major milestone of his image in the West has eroded, as he cannot fulfill this expectation.
Svitlana, the film that was created by the president's office underscored the prisoner exchanges, and this was one of his promises to bring Ukrainian prisoners home. Now, during Zelensky's presidency, he's brought home over 100 prisoners through exchanges. Have you been able to establish a correlation between his ratings and these prisoner exchanges?
When we are talking about the correlation between the focus on the inner context, I mean Donbas, and when we're talking about the support of Zelensky, well, yeah, for sure, his success in getting people back home is very important. On the other hand, we should take into account the broader perspective. And the main issue with politics of Zelensky, international politics of Zelensky, and his diplomacy is that it is non-linear and very small scale. Very small steps which are actually done with no clear strategy for future. Too much would be some kind of Ukraine, and it's about the more reactive politics, while actually Ukraine need more proactive and even more aggressive approach when it's about the stating its own agenda, especially when it's about the so complicated diplomatic situation and war with Russia, because Ukraine, it's not a very small country, it's not, a low-key player. It's a country which actually stopped one of the largest aggressors in the world on its own land, and it should be more, relevant in its position, not being the kind of this always listening small sister or brother of European countries, etc., because there is a clear need of a more proactive position.
And speaking of being more proactive, we've got some really proactive viewers right now. Maria's got a couple questions from Twitter.
Well, I actually wanted to follow up, while we are at the subject of war, I wanted to follow up with something that Oleksandr said earlier. So Oleksandr said that Zelensky was quite naive when he made these promises that he will fulfill, the Minsk agreements will work. But in the film that was just released, Zelensky still says that he is confident that he's going to end this war, that under his tenure this war will end. So he still keeps the same sort of position that he kept back then. What would you say to that? Is he still being naive, or are we getting closer to ending the war?
This is not an equivalent statement to the fulfillment of the Minsk agreement. Now, if we trace his narrative, he is less and less using this promise of fulfilling Minsk agreement. But again, he again says about the ending the war. But now I understand that Zelensky more and more understands that ending the war may mean just the freezing the war, stopping the war, not solving the conflict, but just stopping the war and the freezing the war. And my feeling is that he is gradually coming to understanding that this, in theory, the only possible way to stop it. The political solution is hardly available. I cannot say it for sure. Certainly, he has various advisors. He may say in different way under different circumstances. But I see that generally he has less illusions now than he had a year ago. And we may also, we remember that a few months ago then he said that he has only 1 year to fulfill Minsk agreement. If this way is not available after 1 year, he will have the plan B, which which may be just what we call freezing the conflict.
Okay, we've got one more question, Maria.
Yeah, so what about Crimea? Because it seems like even in the film, Crimea, that is currently occupied by Russia, it was not mentioned, at least I didn't hear it being mentioned. And one of our readers, Maya, she's also asking, does Zelensky have a strategy on how to return Crimea? I mean, I know you're not Zelensky spokespeople, but could you comment on that? Is Crimea really forgotten, or is it put out of the question, out of the agenda?
Well, unfortunately, Crimea agenda is kind of a bit out of the general narrative of Zelensky government, which is quite, a kind of a trouble because, again, it's about the level of the general diplomatic narrative, which is produced by the office of the president. Technically, well, we may speculate a lot about the experience and if people are born politicians or not, but Ukraine doesn't have time, to give people who they have actually to attract a lot of very relevant and very experienced advisors and push on the Ukrainian national agenda at international level, especially now when we have a very complicated future in the face of global economical crisis, global recession, and Ukraine getting into recession, and especially when we have very unclear future. Because what Russia is doing right now, they are trying to, to keep this Transnistria scenario in Donbas, which is not what is okay for Ukraine. And actually, when we are talking about this Crimea occupation, it also what should be very well boosted in terms of negotiations, and it's a not very good step to differentiate the level of discussions when it's about the Paris, for example, negotiation, or it's about Minsk negotiations, because it's this is the approach which is promoted by the Western politicians. Let's divide the issues and eat them step by step. But if we will do this and if we will follow this type actually of attitude, it means that we will have a very, very long-term conflict, which is not what Ukraine needs right now.
You're right, Ukraine doesn't need that, nor can they afford it right now. We've got that 3-minute clip that we've put together, a summary of the Zielinski documentary that was aired. Let's take a look at it now.
Владу перезавантажити ми тільки почали. Тільки почали. Ми зверху. Президент, уряд, Рада, всі ДПшки, державні підприємства, всі наглядові ради. Все потрібно перезавантажити. І тільки тоді країна може мати шанс вилізти з цієї просто прірви. Більше місяця не було вихідних. Ми ж домовлялися, що не будемо жалітися на життя. Тобто це круто, не було вихідних. Ну, значить, що ти комусь потрібен. Значить, твоя робота потрібна для всіх людей. Впливу президента на правоохоронні органи з цієї точки зору, що цю людину треба посадити, а цю не треба чіпати, цього впливу немає. Але щотижня визивати їх і казати, де результат, я впевнений, що такий вплив повинен бути. Я досі не розумію, навіщо нам стільки правоохоронних органів. Це значить, що у нас теж це зроблено було для розмиття відповідальності. Подивіться, вам сьогодні скаже будь-яка країна світу, І Сполучені Штати, і всі європейці, і внутрі країни всі знають, що змінилось в Україні. Наверху ніхто нічого не бере. Нижче є проблеми. На середній ланці серед чиновників багато людей, які там ще працюють по 15-20 років, вони незмінні. Я впевнений, що вони не зміняться. Я впевнений, що їх всіх треба чистити. І зараз дуже багато питань до медичної реформи. Найголовніший мінус моє враження. Я ж не міністр охорони здоров'я, так? Те, що я бачу. А особливо коронавірус зараз показав, що це за медична реформа. Він показав, лікарні не готові. Кількість інфекційних ліжок не готова до такого виклику. Заробітна плата, а це умови наших лікарів, умови, в яких вони працюють, де немає ремонту в лікарні вже багато років. І заробітна плата лікарів дуже мала. Інфраструктури медичної немає. Всі нам казали, що у нас 3 тисячі в Україні. Будьте спокійними, у нас є запас, у нас є маски, їх мільйони на складах. У нас є 3 тисячі працюючих ШВЛів. У нас є з вами десятки лабораторій для перевірки тестів. Ну так я вам скажу, у нас було на початок 5 непрацюючих лабораторій. Зараз працюючих 35. У нас ШВЛів з більш-менш працюючих не було навіть 1000. На країну, де 40 мільйонів. Були прострочені маски. Просто якась, знаєш, така ганьба. Ось і все. Тому, коли ми говоримо такими великими літерами, пишемо на кожному там плакаті, ось вона, друга черга медичної реформи. Ми бачимо зараз, що після коронавірусу потрібно змінити повністю підхід. Ми не змогли поки що припинити повністю вогонь. Поки що. Я би дуже хотів, щоб ми додавали поки що. Я впевнений в тому, що за мою каденцію ми закінчимо цю війну. Чи змінив би я щось? Ні.
It was a beautiful film. Maria, that was a lot of focus on healthcare. Some of the things that were said in the film are a little bit different. You recently had a chance to ask the former acting health minister, Ulana Saprum, some questions about how the government has handled the COVID-19 response. Is it any different from what President Zelenskyy said?
Yeah, it's quite different. So Zelenskyy seemed to be very critical of the medical reform. I mean, he says he's not a health minister. I'm not a health minister myself. But when I asked addressed a question to Dr. Ulana Sapron, she said that she was met with a lot of opposition to start the medical reform. So the reason why things are not working as they should be yet is because there hasn't been enough time, because she only managed to start this medical reform quite late. And what I found very interesting in what Zelenskyy said during the film is that while he's so critical of the medical reform, he doesn't really offer like a substitute for it. He doesn't really say, he just says this is bad and this is not working, we're going to come up with something completely different. But like different what? Ukraine has had 3 different health ministers, like as of just last month and a half. Yeah. And it just sounds like Zelenskyy doesn't really have a medical strategy. I might be wrong, hopefully I am wrong, but it just struck me interesting that while he's so critical of the medical reform that we have now, there doesn't seem to be another option.
Svitlana, this would be a question for you. Ukraine is classically what's considered a low-trust society. And with the COVID-19 global pandemic, getting the citizens of a country that don't necessarily trust the government to follow the directions is particularly difficult. At the same time, since the last month, with the numbers you provided us with, Ukrainians are more worried about the economic effects of the pandemic than really the health effects. What direction could Zelenskyy go to prioritize public health and keep his popularity?
Well, again, if we would talk about the data by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology about the attitude to the COVID pandemic in Ukraine in the context of more general economic and political and social changes and reform, it's not about keeping popularity of Zelensky, it's not about the following some specific, path. It's about the getting the clear strategy of reform of medical system and economics. Because these are two main issues of Ukraine for last year and for the next 2 years, obviously, because what we have right now, it's actually the parliament and government. These are two institutions which are responsible for the development such a strategy, and this is obviously is not performed really well. And for example, Servant of People Party is a source of frustration and has very negative impact for the ranking of popularity of Zelensky in the eyes of people. On the other hand, if you would ask public opinion on the evaluation how they think successful is government in the medical reform or in terms of providing people with some kind of individual protection and dealing with economic crisis in the face of COVID, absolute majority of country is not satisfied with what's going on, because actually only 46% of people are thinking that actually there is some kind of success when it's about the coronavirus fight with pandemic, but on the other hand, 66% of people saying that economy is not really well, and health prices, financial issues, individual protection tools, medical healthcare services, and economical trouble actually connected with corona. This is the pool of questions which are very, very important for now and which don't have any clear answers from the government. Well, we are kind of used to the, these quite quick changes of ministers because it's a kind of this already normal specific normality, let's say so, for Ukrainian politics. But for people, it's not so important who will be the minister, who would be in the government, but what would be the results actually of governmental actions. Well, if you're talking about the general economic crisis, let's be clear on that too. It's a general global crisis, and many countries were not that ready. But when we're talking about the Ukraine, it's a country with a very low level of economic success for years. It's a very poor country, even though it's one of the largest countries and one of the largest countries in Europe, actually. And it's also a lot about the corruption discussions, because when we have a lot of institutions which should fight with corruption and which are provided with really enormous amounts in billions of hryvnias of financial support to fight with corruption, results of their actions for a year are only a couple of thousands of hryvnias, which have been actually subtracted from the so-called corruption processes. And actually, this is a huge issue for contemporary Ukraine. If we would have professional government, if we would have very clear economic strategy, which would follow not some, idealistic path, but which would follow some maybe middle term interests of Ukraine, and if you will get the long-term strategy. Because, well, for example, we have the land reform when the land is open for being actually on a sale right now, but majority population, 60% population, doesn't support this reform, and they didn't support it before. Because they do not trust into the system of legal, procedures which are connected to this. And again, we are coming to the rule of law in Ukraine, which is extremely low and which is very powerful when it's actually coming into the influence on the economical process. So again, we have very contradictory
Svitlana, I'm sorry we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask one last question. So it seems weird that after 1 year of presidency of Zelensky, people don't really understand what side of political spectrum is he on. And this is a question from our readers. So in just like 20 seconds, do you think he's more to the left, more to the right? Does he prefer socialism or rather libertarianism, high taxes or low?
I would say he is non-linear because they change the politics so often that it's not very clear right now what specific type of ideology they are going to follow. And the only hope is that finally maybe they will have a mix of several approaches which would follow the Ukrainian economic interests in the face of needs of general population. This would be maybe what was very important for our country.
Thank you so much.
Svitlana and Alexander, thank you so much for joining us today. We've talked about a year of Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and now we're going to talk about the last week of news from Eastern Europe. We're going to look at a recap from news from Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Russians have found a new way to protest, even in the midst of the coronavirus-induced lockdown. Frustrated by government inaction on the pandemic, particularly on social services, thousands of people have taken to the internet to voice their displeasure. But instead of posting angry screeds on social media pages, they've started protesting in a more innovative way, using maps. Many of Russia's most popular map services give their users the ability to leave tags and comments on geographical areas. Thousands of tags and comments have been left in front of the Red Square in Moscow and in other Russian cities as well. The protesters' most common refrain? We want to eat. The protesters are demanding either the declaration of a full state of emergency, which would allow Russian authorities to distribute funds to individuals and businesses, or a relaxation of the quarantine to return to work. Vedomosti, an independent business newspaper highly respected in Russia, is at risk of becoming yet another managed publication. Write Vedomosti staffers in an editorial blasting their new editor-in-chief. Vedomosti has been at risk of the Kremlin censor ever since they published a poll showing that 38% of Russians believe that Russian President Vladimir Putin puts the interests of oligarchs and bankers ahead of their own. As a result of that poll and the recent sale, which saw Andrei Shmarov assume the position of editor-in-chief, rumors have sprung up painting Shmarov as approved by the Kremlin. And Shmarov has instituted, according to Vedomosti's staff, a policy of censorship of independent polling and other political topics. Armenia and Azerbaijan have agreed to a ceasefire on the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is officially recognized to be part of Azerbaijan. The territory, which recently held an election lambasted by critics as a sham, is a key point of conflict between the two neighboring countries. But the digital meeting between the two countries' foreign ministry represents a first in the negotiation process. And although the Azerbaijani foreign minister emphasized immediately before the meeting that a peaceful resolution was possible, sporadic shooting and conflicts still flare up between the two militaries with alarming regularity. The new president of the completely unrecognized Nagorno-Karabakh Republic said that there should be no peace without the involvement of the NKR government. Georgia's ruling oligarch, Bidzina Ivanishvili, has finally made an appearance after weeks of silence following the start of the coronavirus pandemic. This time on popular song dubbing app TikTok. The video, which shows the oligarch and his son conducting an arcane handshaking ritual, has been met with derision in Georgia, with many Georgians accusing the billionaire oligarch of making light of the coronavirus. Georgia has comparatively fewer corona cases than neighboring countries, and while the government's reaction to the crisis initially drew praise from typically skeptical sources, Georgian oppositionists have called the government's actions a show and have said the state of emergency in the country, recently extended till May 10th, should be canceled. In other Georgian news, the country recently recalled its ambassador from Ukraine after the reintroduction of former Georgian Prime Minister Mikhail Saakashvili to Ukrainian political life by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Special thanks to our guests, Svitlana Khutka and Oleksandr Suhsko, for joining us in the studio today. Thank you very much to Maria Romanenko, who was taking our questions from Twitter. We'll be back next Friday, offering our English-speaking viewers a look into this week's news from Ukraine and Eastern Europe. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. You can keep us going by donating. We're going to show you how. That's the week wrapped up.
I would like us to be heard, not only in Ukraine, but all over the world.
No bread for 3 months.
Not one, but look how many. There's bread here and there.
You are going against the God.
Of course, point number one.
Thanks for the invitation.
When will this all end?
The number of political prisoners has grown.